Hey guys, Michael Luckadoo with ArmchairBuilder.com here. Hey, today I want to show you how to install a custom crown detail that will really change the look of any room in your home. Take a look at the crown detail here behind me. Now, it's made of really low-cost materials, and in fact, it costs less than $100 for this entire bedroom. Now, we're using a smaller crown molding, which is easier for the inexperienced DIYer to work with, and a cap mold that'll be located about 7 inches below it. Then we're going to paint both pieces of trim and the space between them the same color. Now what this does is two things. One, it gives the appearance of an absolutely massive crown molding at a very low cost. And two, it can make any room feel bigger. So let's take a look. So the first thing we do is make a line 7 inches down from the ceiling with our level all the way around the room. Now this will give us a guide for placing the bottom edge of the cap molding. So you can see with our speed square here that none of the corners are actually exactly 90 degrees. So we'll be coping the inside corners on all the crown molding. This way we won't have to mess with any off-angle miter cuts. So guys, we're going to start off with our first piece of trim above the door. It's always good to start with a smaller piece to get your feet wet and also to just get some practice if you haven't done this before. Now we're using this small molding. It's about 1.1 inches deep, and it's got a nice profile to it. And what we've decided to do is put the actual thick part of the profile up. I think it's going to give us a better look. You know, you decide either way. There's really no rhyme or reason for it. But what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to use a smaller crown molding, which is going to make it easier to cut, easier to work with, especially for someone who hasn't done this before. And it's also a cheaper installation, but it's going to give you a nice big, bang for your buck. Okay, so we've cut this one 48 inches. Make sure you always cut. They always say measure cut. You measure twice, cut once. Just make sure that you always cut a little bit long for the first piece. You can always trim it down. This way you're not going to waste a lot of material. So let's check our first piece here. So now we'll put some quick grab glue on there and we'll nail it into place with some 2-inch brad nails. Now guys, when you're using a nail gun like this to secure trim, you want to check the air pressure in your gun. Make sure that it's set properly and make sure that your nails are just penetrating the surface so that you can fill those with some good wood putty or some painter's putty and then go back and paint it later. You don't want this blowing out your trim. It's going to make your job a whole lot harder to finish. Now because the cap molding is small, we're going to miter cut the inside corners. So we're going to set the saw to a 45-degree miter, and then we're going to take the piece of trim, each piece of trim, and set it up against the rip fence of the saw, just like we would up against the wall, and then cut it. Let's cut it. So guys, the next piece of trim we're going to install is going to start in this corner behind me, and it's going to run along this wall. Now, piece of trim isn't long enough to make it all the way to the next corner. So we're going to need a joint in the middle of the wall on the piece of trim. So what we want to do is cut what they call a scarf joint, okay? And that's basically just a 45 between the two pieces. So if those pieces shrink or they move at all, we're not going to see a gap between them and they're going to cover each other. Let me show you how it's done. So instead of cutting a butt joint in these pieces where it's a 90-degree cut, we're going to cut it on a 45. So you can see this piece here as an example. This one's cut on a 45 as well. And we're going to just kind of show you how they go together like so. And once they get nailed and glued into place just right, even if there's some movement in the trim, it'll cover up that movement. It's going to be harder to see it than if you had a butt joint. Okay guys, so we're ready to start installing the crown molding. Now, there's a couple of things that are going to make this job easier if you haven't installed crown before. And I'm going to give you a few tips. First of all, here's the profile of the actual crown that we're going to be using, okay? Now, make sure that these double pieces here, this double indentation on the crown is at the bottom. A lot of people have a tendency for some reason to flip this thing around, and that's just not how it goes. It's going to look weird, okay? I've even seen in professionally built homes where this is actually installed upside down. The other thing that I like to do, and I think I would encourage you to do it, take a scrap piece like this, go around the room, and actually fit this up into between the ceiling and the wall, and make a line underneath that piece. And we've done that all the way around the room here to make sure that when you're up there on the ladder and you've got glue on this, you've got a nail gun in one hand, and you're trying to position and level out the piece and get it snug between the ceiling and the wall. What can happen is it can slide and move on you, and if it does, and you put nails into that thing and it gets stuck into that position, your miters aren't going to work. It's going to look horrible. So you want to make sure that you get this thing exactly how it's supposed to be positioned between the ceiling and the wall. And one way to do that, to make an easy reference, is to draw a line underneath here. We're going to paint the area between the actual bottom molding here and the crown, so that's already going to be covered, so we're not worried about making marks on there. So guys, before we actually start installing the crown molding, I like to plan out the room, okay? So, if we do have one long wall, I like to start with that. Like we said before, we're going to actually cope these angles because the drywall corners aren't exactly 90 degrees. So we're going to cope the cuts. And that first piece you put up there is going to have 90-degree cuts on both sides. So it's going to be, you might as well take that longest piece that's harder to hold into place and get it exactly where it needs to be. And let's go ahead and install that one first. So now we're going to install the piece to the left. So we turn over the crown upside down on the compound miter saw. The finished piece is to the right, and we adjust the saw to 45-degree miter to the right. Notice we're holding the crown molding at the same angle it would be between the ceiling and the wall. And what this does is it prevents you from having to use the bevel cut on the compound saw. All we need with this is the miter side. So now with our coping saw, we remove the raw cut end of the piece of crown. You angle the saw back so the piece will fit tight against the crown to the right of it. Now we use a piece of sandpaper to clean up the cut edge. So for the left side of an outside angle, the crown is placed up against the rip fence, again upside down, and the saw is adjusted so it's a bevel cut to the left. The finished piece then is on the right hand side of the saw blade. So as we mentioned before, when a piece of trim needs to be joined in the middle of the wall, we do it with a 45-degree bevel cut at a stud. So let's review the cuts for crown molding. If you have an outside corner like this one and you want to cut the left side, you turn the piece upside down, adjust the saw 45-degree miter to the left, and then the finished piece is going to be on the right after you cut it. So that's the left side of an outside corner. So now to get the right side of an outside angle, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to take the piece, turn it upside down, angle it against the rip fence in the bottom of the saw, turn the miter of the saw 45 degrees to the right, cut it, and the finished piece is on the left. Now to take care of an inside angle, the left side of it, we're going to turn the piece upside down, and again angle it against the rip fence in the bottom of the saw just like you would up against the wall. You're going to miter cut 45 degrees to the right, and the finished piece is going to be on the right. And then basically once that's cut, we can use our coping saw to remove the back side of that from the cut edge of the finished and the rough cut edge all the way back so it fits tight against the piece on the right hand side. So now with some prep work and paint, you'll have a nice custom trim detail that will really set your space apart from the rest, all for less than $100 in materials. If you're thinking of remodeling or building new, be sure to stop by and see us at armchairbuilder.com for some great money and time-saving resources.